All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive today. We're tackling a true crime case, one that'll really take us through the ups and downs of the criminal justice system.
Buckle up.
You'd mentioned being interested in cases where the system, well, maybe didn't work quite right.
Yeah, cases where it seems like it failed.
Exactly. And this one, oh boy, did this one fit that bill. We've got a whole mountain of documents, court stuff, articles from over the years.
Almost 20 years worth. It's going to be a ride.
So, to set the scene, 1982, small town Clearview, Washington. Boom, a brutal triple homicide hits, shakes the place up. But here's the thing.
The victims knew the killer.
They did. This wasn't some random act. This was personal,
Mm-hmm.
rooted in some stuff the justice system maybe overlooked, maybe mishandled.
Definitely mishandled.
Okay, so let's meet our main player here. Charles Rodman Campbell, born in Hawaii, 1954, and his early life. Let's just say it was troubled.
That's putting it mildly.
Drinking, drugs, all by 13. In and out of juvenile detention, even did time at Green Hill School, supposed to help with, antisocial behavior.
Right. Yes.
Now, get this. At 23, his juvenile records, poof, gone.
Erased.
Erased. Washington State, they were all about giving him a clean slate.
The Washington State Division of Juvenile Rehabilitation, they handled that.
New start, right. Well, just 1 year later, 1974, he attacks Renee Wickland. Brutally.
This was a vicious attack. He even used Renee's infant daughter as a way to force her to comply.
It was calculated, the cruelty. I mean,
It's a lot.
Now, Renee, she's strong. She testifies. Campbell gets slammed with 40 years, assault, sodomy, the whole 9 yards.
You'd think that's it, right? Justice served, end of story.
Right. Nope. The sentences run concurrently.
That's where the legal system gets tricky. Concurrent means all those years they're served at the same time, not one after the other.
So 40 years doesn't really mean 40 years.
Not at all.
Renee, she didn't know any of this. She thought he was locked up tight. She's rebuilding, dealing with all the trauma, raising her daughter alone, and then, bam, another tragedy. Her husband dies.
Freak ass.
More loss, more fear. And meanwhile, Campbell's in prison, but not exactly finding his zen, so to speak.
Disciplinary problems, violence, even raped other inmates. Oh, and he had a relationship with a counselor. They had a kid.
And somehow, despite all that, he's deemed eligible for work release.
How does that happen?
Seriously, what went wrong there?
Yeah.
Was it like different departments not talking to each other? Did they just not grasp how serious his crimes were?
I mean, this is what's so fascinating and messed up about this stuff, right? The system, it's supposed to work, but...
But sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And here comes the fallout from that work release decision. April 14th, 1982, Campbell shows up at Renee Wickland's home and commits a truly horrifying crime.
He doesn't just kill Renee. He murders her 9-year-old daughter, Shanna,
Oh, God.
and their neighbor, Barbara Hendrickson. She testified against him in that first trial.
And this wasn't just, a quick, clean thing. This was...
Brutal. Mutilation, earrings ripped out, the whole awful 9 yards.
It's chilling. And to make it even worse, that same day, Campbell tries to rape another woman. This wasn't just like a crime of passion or something.
This was rage, revenge, all mixed together.
So the crime scene, it's a mess. Bloody handprints everywhere, jewelry. He even dumped stuff in the river.
All pointing right back to Campbell. It was sloppy.
Sloppy. But the murders themselves were so precise, so calculated.
Like he lost control, but also the revenge that was planned.
Makes you wonder, was he trying to terrorize them, make sure they knew it was him, or was he just losing it?
Psychologically, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Then comes the trial. Campbell, he's not talking, won't testify, won't even mention the murders. He even cross-examines his own girlfriend.
Trying to play it down like he didn't have that much resentment towards Renee.
It was a weird strategy.
To say the least.
Clearview is reeling. Petitions for the death penalty are flying around. Renee's family, they had no idea about the previous rape. They're devastated.
I'd be blindsided.
The prosecution, they've got a tough case. No living witness makes proving the timeline a nightmare.
And the extent of the injuries? Well, the judge threw out the rape charge, even though there was evidence.
But the evidence they did have, it was overwhelming. Campbell, guilty of 3 murders, but even on death row, this guy, he's not showing an ounce of remorse.
Volatile behavior. Even spat on the governor during a prison visit.
Unbelievable.
Right.
So this is where we circle back to the system failing, right? Lawsuits pop up, people claiming the state was negligent, letting Campbell out on work release,
His case actually changed laws in Washington.
trying to prevent another tragedy like this.
Exactly.
So Campbell gets the death penalty, 12 years on death row, appeals, his mother going back and forth. Does she support him? Does she not? And then there are these psych reports,
Deeply antisocial worldview, that's what they said.
and there's this one quote. It just sends chills down my spine. Campbell says, and I quote, "The world created me, and I am free to do what I want. There is no right or wrong."
It's like looking into the mind of someone who genuinely believed he was above it all, you know? Rules, consequences didn't apply to him.
It's chilling. No remorse, no concept of right and wrong. It's chilling. And it makes you wonder, facing his own execution, what was going through his mind?
It's a fascinating psychological question. Here's a man who lived his life defying authority, believing himself above the law, and now he's facing the ultimate consequence, the ultimate loss of control.
Right. And in Washington at that time, death row inmates had a choice: lethal injection or hanging. But there was a catch. If they refused to choose, they were automatically hanged.
And true to form, Charles Rodman Campbell refused to choose, so hanging it was.
Almost like one last act of defiance, a refusal to participate in the system that was about to end his life.
You could definitely interpret it that way.
There were, of course, the expected last-minute appeals and pleas for clemency. His mother, despite her conflicted feelings, was fighting desperately to save him. And then you have Governor Mike Lowry, who was personally opposed to the death penalty, taking the unprecedented step of meeting with Campbell in person.
It's a remarkable moment, isn't it? The governor, facing intense pressure from both sides of the death penalty debate, chooses to sit down with this convicted triple murderer. It really demonstrates Lowry's commitment to fully understanding the weight of the decision he had to make.
It must have been an incredibly difficult decision. And ultimately, after meeting with Campbell, with the victims' families, and considering the overwhelming public opinion, Lowry decided to allow the execution to proceed.
A heavy decision, no doubt. And it really highlights the complex ethical and moral issues surrounding capital punishment, issues that society continues to grapple with.
Now, Campbell's final hours were, well, let's just say they were in keeping with his character. He resisted being moved to the holding cell, and they actually had to use pepper spray to subdue him. Later, they found a piece of metal in his cell that he had sharpened into a makeshift weapon.
It's as if he was clinging to any shred of control he could find, even as his options were disappearing. Sharpening that metal, was it a desperate attempt at escape? A way to lash out one last time? Or simply a way to maintain some semblance of agency in a situation where he had virtually none? It's a question that speaks to the human need for control, even in the face of the inevitable.
He was offered a last meal, a fish dinner, but he barely touched it. He spent some time with friends and family, but his final hours must have been incredibly isolating, even with people around.
Imagine the psychological impact of imminent death, especially for someone like Campbell, who had built his entire life around defiance, around the belief that he was above the law. To be confronted with that ultimate consequence, the absolute finality of it all, it must have been a jarring and deeply unsettling experience, regardless of how tough he appeared on the surface.
And then the execution itself. It took place just after midnight on May 27, 1994. Witnesses described him struggling as they strapped him to the board, having difficulty placing the hood over his head. It sounds incredibly gruesome.
It's important to remember that hanging, even when carried out according to protocol, is a violent act. And in Campbell's case, the details suggest it was a particularly difficult process. This raises important questions about the humanity of capital punishment, regardless of one's personal stance on the issue itself.
His death, however, was quick. Just a few minutes after the trapdoor opened, the official cause: a broken neck and severed spinal cord. No one claimed his body initially, so he was cremated by the county. His girlfriend and son claimed his ashes later, fulfilling his request.
And with that, Charles Rodman Campbell's story comes to an end. Or does it?
That's a great question, because his story, as horrifying as it is, doesn't end with his death, does it?
Not at all. The impact of his crimes, the systemic failures that allowed them to happen, the questions it raised about the justice system and capital punishment, those are all part of his legacy.
And then there's the fact that even after his execution, there was speculation that Campbell might have been involved in another unsolved murder.
You're talking about the Hallie Seaman case, a chilling possibility.
Yeah, the Hallie Seaman case. It's hard to believe that even after all this, there could be more.
It's a chilling thought. Hallie Seaman was a student in Washington. She was sexually assaulted and murdered in 1975, just a year after Campbell attacked Renee Wickland.
What makes investigators think Campbell could be connected to this case?
There are some similarities between the cases, particularly the brutality of the crimes and how the crime scenes were staged. Plus, Campbell was known to be in that area when Seaman was murdered.
So even after being executed for a triple homicide, his shadow still hangs over other unsolved cases. It makes you wonder just how many other victims might be out there.
It's a sobering thought and speaks to the lasting impact of violent crime, not just on the victims and their families, but on entire communities. The fear, the uncertainty, it lingers.
It also brings up the limitations of the justice system. Even when there's a conviction, what happens when there could be more victims out there? How do you find closure when the person responsible is already gone?
Those are tough questions, and unfortunately, there are no easy answers. But I think it emphasizes the importance of persistent investigation, even in cold cases. Technology advances, new evidence might emerge, and sometimes those breakthroughs can finally bring a sense of peace to the families left behind.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Charles Rodman Campbell, what are the most crucial things for me to take away from all this?
I think the most important takeaway is that even with its complexities and safeguards, the justice system is ultimately a human one. It's prone to errors, oversights, and sadly, sometimes fails to protect the innocent. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of violence and the ripple effects of these crimes.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the details of the case, the legal proceedings, the investigation, but at the heart of it all are real people whose lives were forever changed by Campbell's actions.
Exactly. And for someone like you, with a keen interest in criminal justice, I think this case highlights the importance of looking beyond the headlines. It's about understanding the complexities of human behavior, the factors that contribute to violence, and the constant need for reform and improvement within the system.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating and incredibly disturbing. Thanks for guiding me through it.
It's been my pleasure. As you continue exploring true crime, remember the human element. These aren't just stories, they are real lives forever marked by tragedy.
Well said. Until next time. That quote, I mean, it's bone-chilling. Like, no remorse, no understanding of right and wrong. Facing execution, what do you think was going on in his head?
Well, you have to consider this is a man who spent his whole life basically saying, screw you to authority, right? Believing he was above it all. And suddenly, here comes this ultimate consequence, the ultimate loss of control.
And back then, in Washington, you had a choice on death row, lethal injection, or hanging. But there was this, like, weird rule.
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't choose, they hung you by default.
It was the state's method at the time.
And Campbell, of course, he refused to choose. So hanging it was...
Like a final act of rebellion.
Right.
Not giving the system what it wanted.
Totally. So last-minute appeals, clemency pleas, all that, it was happening. His mother, even with everything, she was desperate to save him.
It's understandable. A mother's love, even in these circumstances.
And then you have Governor Mike Lowry. Now, he was personally against the death penalty, and he actually took this crazy step of meeting with Campbell face-to-face.
That's pretty unheard of, right? A governor actually meeting with a death row inmate.
Right. I mean, he's got pressure from both sides. The death penalty debate is raging, and he sits down with a convicted triple murderer. That's got to be one of the toughest calls a governor has to make.
You've got the families of the victims, public opinion, your own personal beliefs.
And ultimately, Lowry decided the execution would go forward.
It's a heavy decision, no doubt about it. It really shows you how tangled up the whole issue of capital punishment is.
It's not black and white at all. So Campbell's final hours, they were, well, very much in character, you could say. He fought against being moved to the holding cell. They had to use pepper spray on him.
They also found a piece of metal in his cell, sharpened it.
Like a shiv.
Yeah, makeshift weapon. It's like he was grasping at some kind of control, even when there was none left, you know?
Right.
Was it a last-ditch escape attempt? Was it pure anger? Or maybe just this desperate need to feel like he had some agency in a situation where he had zero?
He was offered a last meal, fish, but he barely touched it. Had some time with friends, family, but those final hours, they must have been so lonely.
Think about it. This guy, defiance was his whole identity, believing he was above the rules. And now he's hit with this absolute finality. It's gotta mess with your head.
The execution was just after midnight, May 27th, 1994. People said he struggled when they strapped him to the board, couldn't get the hood over his head easily.
Hanging, even when it's done right, it's a violent way to go. And with Campbell, it sounds like it was particularly rough. It really makes you think about the whole concept of capital punishment.
He was quick, though. Just a few minutes, trapdoor opens, broken neck, severed spinal cord. No one claimed his body at first, so the county cremated him. His girlfriend and son, guy's ashes later, like he wanted.
And so the story of Charles Rodman Campbell comes to a close.
But does it really?
That's a great question, because his story, as horrifying as it is, doesn't end with his death, does it?
Not at all. The impact of his crimes, the systemic failures that allowed them to happen, the questions it raised about the justice system and capital punishment, Those are all part of his legacy.
Hmm.
And then there's the fact that even after his execution, there was speculation that Campbell might have been involved in another unsolved murder.
You're talking about the Hallie and Seaman case. A chilling possibility.
It's hard to believe there could be even more to this story.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought, really. Hallie Ann Seaman, she was a student over in Washington. This was 1975, so just a year after Campbell attacked Renee Wicklund. And she was sexually assaulted and murdered.
What made people think Campbell might be involved in this, too?
Well, there are some similarities between the cases. The brutality, how the crime scenes were, well, staged. And Campbell, we know he was in that area around the time Seaman was killed.
So even after being executed, his shadow's still hanging over these unsolved cases. Makes you wonder how many other victims might there be?
It's a tough thought, isn't it? And it really shows you the impact, the lasting impact of these kinds of crimes, not just on the victims, the families, but whole communities.
It's like this fear, this uncertainty, it just hangs in the air.
It does.
It also makes you think about the limits of the system. Even when you get a conviction, what if there are more victims out there? Where's the closure when the person who did it is gone?
Those are hard questions, and honestly, there aren't easy answers. But I think it shows how important it is to keep investigating, even cold cases. Technology gets better, new evidence pops up, and sometimes that's what leads to a breakthrough. It can at least offer some peace to the families.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Charles Rodman Campbell, what are the big takeaways for me?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that even with all its rules, its safeguards, the justice system, it's still run by people. People make mistakes, things get overlooked, and sometimes it just plain fails to protect the innocent.
And then there's the human cost.
Right.
All this violence, it has a ripple effect.
Huge ripple effect.
It's easy to get caught up in the details, the legal stuff, the investigation. But we can't forget, at the heart of this, there are real people whose lives were changed forever because of what Campbell did.
You're right. It's about those people. And for you, with your interest in criminal justice, I think this case shows why it's important to go beyond the headlines. It's not just about the crime itself. It's about understanding why people do these things, what leads to violence, and how we can make the system better.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, though definitely disturbing. Thanks for walking me through it all.
Happy to do it. And as you keep digging into true crime, remember, these aren't just stories. They're real lives, forever marked by these tragedies.
Well said. Until next time, everyone.